Maya stood frozen in the doorway of her small diner. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot where hundreds of people now gathered, their faces turned toward her with an intensity that made her heart race. Camera flashes popped like lightning. News vans with satellite dishes lined the street. A police officer approached, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Chen, we need to establish a perimeter. The crowd is getting larger by the minute." Maya's hands trembled as she clutched the door frame for support. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. Just yesterday, her diner had been nearly empty, another quiet day of struggling to keep the lights on. And now this. All because of him. All because of what she'd done for the old man in the tattered military jacket who'd appeared during last night's storm. "Ma'am," the officer's voice pulled her back to the present. "Did you hear what I said? They're here for you, all of them." Maya nodded numbly, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto a familiar face, the weathered features of the veteran who had changed everything. He stood at the edge of the gathering, leaning on his cane, watching her with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten wars. When their gazes met, he offered a small, sad smile. Too late, Maya realized exactly what he had done, and why her life would never be the same again. 24 hours earlier, rain pounded against the windows of Chen's Corner Cafe as Maya wiped down the counter for the third time that hour. The diner was empty except for a young couple huddled in the corner booth, sharing a slice of pie and waiting for the downpour to ease. 6 months since she'd taken over her father's failing business, and Maya was beginning to think she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The small-town diner had been a neighborhood institution once, but times had changed. The shopping mall on the edge of town had stolen most of their customers, and the economic downturn had taken care of the rest. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "A restaurant isn't just about food, Maya, it's about heart. You feed people's souls first, their stomachs second." Easy for him to say. He hadn't left her with mounting debts and equipment that broke down weekly. The latest disaster, a refrigerator on its last legs, would cost $3,000 to replace, money she simply didn't have. The bell above the door jingled and Maya looked up, plastering on her professional smile before she even registered who had entered. The smile faltered when she saw him, an elderly man, soaked to the bone, with a ragged military jacket hanging off his thin frame. A Vietnam veteran, judging by the patches. His gray beard was untrimmed, and he leaned heavily on a wooden cane that looked as weathered as he did. Maya tensed. She'd dealt with homeless individuals before, usually having to turn them away when they couldn't pay. It always made her feel terrible, but business was business, and she couldn't afford charity. The man shuffled toward the counter, leaving puddles in his wake. Up close, Maya noticed his eyes, a startling blue that seemed incongruously alert in his haggard face. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice surprisingly clear and deep. "Terrible night out there." "It is," Maya agreed cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man glanced at the menu board behind her. "Just a cup of coffee, if you don't mind. Black." Maya hesitated. A cup of coffee was the cheapest item on the menu, but she knew this interaction probably wouldn't end there. "Coffee's $2, she said, immediately feeling petty for emphasizing the price. To her surprise, the man reached into his pocket and produced 2 crumpled $1 bills, placing them carefully on the counter as if they were precious. "Perfect," he said with a slight smile, "got just enough." Something in his dignity made Maya's chest tighten. She took the money and turned to pour the coffee, adding an extra splash before returning with the steaming cup. "Thank you kindly." He wrapped his gnarled hands around the mug, seeming to savor the warmth before taking a sip. "Best coffee I've had in weeks. Name's Frank, by the way, Frank Holloway." "Maya Chen," she responded automatically, then immediately wondered why she'd shared her name with a stranger. Frank nodded, looking around the empty diner. "Your place." "My father's, well, mine now. He passed away last year. Sorry to hear that, he Chinese. Yes, came here in the 70s. Frank's eyes brightened. The 70s, huh? I was just getting back from Nam around then, different world. The young couple in the corner stood up, leaving cash on the table as they prepared to brave the rain. Maya excused herself to clear their dishes, conscious of Frank watching her movements. When she returned, he had nearly finished his coffee. You make good food here, he asked. Maya nodded. My father's recipes, he was the cook, I'm still learning. Frank seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Finally, he spoke. I don't suppose you'd be willing to trade a meal for some work. I noticed your gutters are overflowing out front. I could clear them for you. Used to be a handyman before. He gestured vaguely at his cane. Maya should have said no. The rational, business-minded part of her brain was screaming to say no. But something about the man's direct gaze, the absence of self-pity in his request, made her pause. Actually, she found herself saying, I have a stool that needs fixing in the back, and the light fixture above the entrance has been flickering for weeks. Frank's face lit up with something that looked like purpose. I can handle that. Just point me to your tools. For the next hour, Maya watched in amazement as Frank transformed. Despite his limp and obvious physical limitations, his hands moved with practiced efficiency. He fixed the wobbly stool, replaced the light fixture, and even managed to find and fix a leak under the sink that had been driving her crazy for months. By the time he finished, the rain had stopped, and the clock showed just past 9, closing time. Maya placed a generous plate of beef stew and mashed potatoes in front of him, along with a slice of apple pie. This is too much, Frank protested, though his eyes devoured the food. You earned it, Maya said simply. You just saved me at least $100 in repair costs. As Frank ate, Maya cleaned up, stealing glances at him. Where was he going after this? The night was cold, and despite the rain stopping, the forecast predicted temperatures near freezing. Do you have somewhere to stay tonight? She asked finally, trying to sound casual. Frank finished chewing before answering. I've got a spot, under the highway overpass. Pretty dry there most nights. Maya's stomach twisted. The overpass was a notorious homeless encampment, dangerous and frequently cleared out by police. Frank, It's fine, he cut her off gently. I've slept in worse places, much worse. Something dark flickered across his face, and Maya knew he was remembering Vietnam. Perhaps it was her father's voice in her head. Perhaps it was simple human decency. Or perhaps it was something in Frank's eyes, a dignity that refused to be extinguished by circumstance. Whatever the reason, Maya heard herself say, I have a storage room in the back with a cot. My dad used to nap there during long shifts. You could stay there tonight if you want. It's not much, but it's warm. Frank stared at her, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. For a moment, Maya thought he might refuse out of pride. That's very kind, he said finally, his voice slightly hoarse. Are you sure? Maya wasn't sure. In fact, she was fairly certain she was being foolish, but she nodded anyway. Just for tonight, she added. It's going to freeze out there. After closing up, Maya showed Frank to the small storage room. It wasn't much. Boxes of supplies stacked against the walls, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, and a space heater that rattled loudly when turned on. But compared to an overpass in near-freezing temperatures, it was luxury. Bathrooms through there, she pointed. There's towels if you want to clean up. I'll be back at 6 to open tomorrow. Frank stood in the center of the small room, his posture strangely formal. Thank you, Maya. This means more than you know. Maya felt suddenly awkward. It's nothing, really, get some rest. As she turned to leave, Frank spoke again. Your father would be proud of you. The words hit Maya with unexpected force. She nodded quickly and shut the door before he could see the sudden moisture in her eyes. Driving home to her small apartment, Maya wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd let a homeless stranger, A man she knew nothing about stay in her restaurant overnight. He could rob her blind. He could burn the place down accidentally. He could be dangerous. But something told her Frank wasn't any of those things. Something told her he was exactly what he appeared to be, a veteran who'd fallen on hard times, a man who'd served his country only to be forgotten by it. That night, Maya slept better than she had in months. She arrived at the diner early the next morning, half expecting to find the place ransacked or Frank gone. Instead, she found him sweeping the floor, the entire restaurant spotless in a way it hadn't been since her father's time. "Morning," he called cheerfully. "Hope you don't mind. Thought I'd make myself useful." Maya stood dumbfounded in the doorway. "You didn't have to do this." "Wanted to," Frank replied simply. "Best night's sleep I've had in years. Least I could do." As Maya prepared to open, Frank continued cleaning, moving with more energy than she would have thought possible given his age and condition. When customers began trickling in, the usual morning regulars, he naturally fell into the role of busboy, clearing tables and chatting easily with the patrons. Several of the older customers recognized him from around town and greeted him by name. To Maya's surprise, Frank seemed well known and liked, despite his circumstances. One elderly woman clasped his hand and thanked him for helping her change a tire last month. "You know all these people?" Maya asked during a lull. Frank shrugged. "Been in this town a long time, before things went south for me." By lunchtime, the diner was busier than usual. Word seemed to have spread that Frank was there, and several veterans came in specifically to see him. Maya watched, fascinated, as they greeted him with the unique camaraderie of those who had shared unspeakable experiences. "Frank was a legend in our unit," one man told Maya as she refilled his coffee. "Saved my life twice over there. Most decorated soldier I ever knew." "Really?" Maya glanced at Frank, who was laughing with another veteran at the counter. "Purple Heart, Bronze Star, the works," the man continued, "but you'd never hear it from him." Throughout the day, Maya pieced together Frank's story from snippets of conversation. He'd been a highly decorated soldier who'd returned from Vietnam with severe PTSD, though it wasn't called that back then. He'd managed for years, working construction and as a handyman, married with 2 children. Then his wife died of cancer, medical bills mounted, and the economic crash of 2008 had wiped out his savings. A fall from a roof 3 years ago had left him with a permanent limp and unable to work his usual jobs. His children had moved away, one to California, one to Florida, and while they sent money when they could, they had families of their own to support. Too proud to move in with them and become a burden, Frank had slowly slipped into homelessness. By closing time, Maya had made a decision. "Stay another night," she told Frank. "In fact, I have a proposal for you." Frank raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I need help around here," Maya said. "A busboy, someone to handle minor repairs, maybe eventually help with some cooking. The pay wouldn't be much to start, but it includes room and board. You could stay in the back room, make it your own space." Frank stared at her, his weathered face unreadable. "Why would you do this for me?" he asked finally. "You barely know me." Maya thought about her father, about his belief in the restaurant as more than just a business. "Because this place is supposed to have heart," she said simply, "and you need a break." Frank looked away and Maya could see he was fighting emotion. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity. I genuinely need the help and you're good with the customers. They like you. Some came in today just because you were here." That much was true. The day's receipts were nearly double a normal Tuesday. Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Let me think about it overnight." Maya nodded, respecting his need for dignity. Fair enough. That evening before leaving, Maya showed Frank how to work the industrial dishwasher and where the extra supplies were kept. As she was about to leave, Frank cleared his throat. "There's something I think you should see," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a battered smartphone, surprising Maya, who hadn't pegged him as someone who would have such technology. "My daughter insists I keep this," he explained, seeing her expression, "for emergencies." He tapped the screen a few times, then handed it to Maya. A Facebook page was open, showing what appeared to be a community group for their town. The most recent post was from that afternoon. "Just saw Frank Holloway at Chen's Corner Cafe. The owner has apparently given him a job and a place to stay. About time someone in this town showed some real compassion to our veterans. Chen's has earned my business for life." The post had hundreds of likes and dozens of comments, all overwhelmingly positive. People were pledging to visit the restaurant, praising Maya, sharing their own stories about Frank. "I had nothing to do with this," Frank said quickly. "Must have been one of the guys who came in today." Maya scrolled through the comments, stunned. Her small act of kindness was apparently touching a nerve in the community. "This is unexpected," she managed. Frank took the phone back, looking slightly embarrassed. "People get worked up about veterans these days, especially the older ones like me. Makes them feel patriotic to care, I guess." Maya handed him back the phone, oddly touched by the community's response but unsure what to make of it. "Well, it's nice they care," she said. "Get some rest, Frank." That night, as Maya drove home, her phone pinged repeatedly with notifications. The Facebook post had been shared in several local groups, and people were tagging her personal account and the restaurant's rarely used page. There were dozens of messages from strangers, praising her for helping Frank and promising to visit the restaurant. It was overwhelming and slightly uncomfortable. She hadn't helped Frank for publicity or praise. It had been a simple human response to someone in need. The fact that people found it so remarkable was actually somewhat sad. Shouldn't helping others be normal rather than extraordinary? Still, as Maya checked the restaurant's social media pages, she couldn't help feeling a flutter of hope. The diner had been on the brink of failure for months. If this translated into actual customers, it could make a real difference. She fell asleep wondering what tomorrow would bring, never imagining just how dramatically things were about to change. Maya arrived at the diner early the next morning, surprised to find several cars already in the parking lot despite the closed sign still hanging in the window. As she approached the entrance, she could see Frank inside, talking to someone through the glass door. When he spotted her, he unlocked the door with an apologetic expression. "Morning, sorry about this. They started showing up about 20 minutes ago." Maya stepped inside to find 3 people she didn't recognize standing in her restaurant. One held a professional camera, another a notepad. "Ms. Chen," a woman in a crisp blazer stepped forward, hand extended. "I'm Jennifer Reynolds from the Tribune. We'd love to get a few quotes about what you're doing for Mr. Holloway here." "What I'm doing?" Maya glanced at Frank, who looked as confused as she felt. "Your initiative to help homeless veterans," the reporter continued eagerly. "The Facebook post has gone viral overnight. You're trending locally." Before Maya could respond, the bell jangled again as more people entered, customers this time, looking around expectantly. "Are you open?" a middle-aged woman asked. "We saw the post and wanted to come support what you're doing." Yes, we're just opening," Maya stammered, caught off guard by the sudden attention. The next hour passed in a blur as Maya and Frank scrambled to get the diner ready while fielding questions from the reporter. More customers arrived, far more than the diner had seen in months, along with 2 more journalists and someone claiming to represent a local veterans organization. By mid-morning, every table was full, with people waiting outside. Maya had to call in her only part-time waitress for emergency help, and even then, they could barely keep up with orders. Frank moved through the crowd with surprising energy, bussing tables, refilling coffee, and graciously answering questions about his military service, despite clearly being uncomfortable with the attention. Just before noon, Maya was expediting orders in the kitchen when Frank appeared at her side. "Maya," he said urgently, "you need to see this." He led her to the door where she could see through the window. The parking lot, which had been busy all morning, was now completely full. Cars lined the street in both directions, and people, dozens of them, stood in the lot, apparently waiting for a chance to enter the diner. "What's happening?" Maya whispered, unable to comprehend the scene. Frank handed her his phone. On the screen was a news website with the headline, "Small-Town Diner Owners Act of Kindness Toward Homeless Veteran Sparks Movement." Below it was a photo of her and Frank, taken earlier that morning without her knowledge. The article described how she had not only fed a forgotten hero, but given him purpose and dignity through employment and housing. It quoted several veterans who had visited yesterday, praising Frank's service record and Maya's compassion. But what really caught Maya's attention was the final paragraph. The story has ignited a passionate response on social media, with thousands sharing Chen's example as a call to action for better treatment of veterans nationwide. Several prominent veterans advocates have highlighted the story, and at least one celebrity has shared it with millions of followers. A GoFundMe page started to help Ms. Chen expand her veteran outreach program has raised over $15,000 in less than 24 hours. Veteran Outreach Program. Maya looked up at Frank in bewilderment. "GoFundMe. I don't have a program. I don't know anything about a fundraiser." Frank's expression was a mixture of amazement and concern. Someone's taken quite a few liberties with the story. It's snowballed. Maya felt a surge of panic. "This is crazy. I just offered you a job and a place to stay, that's it. I didn't start a movement or a program or—" She was interrupted by the waitress calling for help with orders. For the next several hours, Maya had no time to think about the bizarre situation unfolding around her. She cooked, served, rang up customers, and tried to keep up with the unexpected deluge of business. Throughout it all, Frank was a steady presence, working tirelessly despite his obvious physical limitations. By mid-afternoon, when there was finally a brief lull, Maya pulled Frank into the kitchen for a private word. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "There's a line down the block. The phone won't stop ringing. I've had 3 different veterans organizations call asking how they can partner with us. Someone from the mayor's office left a message about giving me a community service award." Frank nodded grimly. "It's the power of social media. Stories like this, they take on a life of their own." "But it's based on a misunderstanding," Maya insisted. "I'm not running some big program for veterans. I just helped you." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Would you want to, though?" "Want to what?" "Run a program, help more vets." He gestured toward the dining room. "You've got the attention now. You've got people willing to donate to support whatever you want to do." Maya stared at him, the implications slowly dawning on her. The diner had made more money today than in the past 2 weeks combined. The GoFundMe, which she still knew nothing about, had apparently raised thousands. People were excited about what they thought she was doing. Could she actually turn this misunderstanding into something real, something meaningful? Before she could answer, the bell above the door jangled again. Maya peered out to see a small fleet of news vans pulling into the parking lot, their satellite dishes extending skyward. "Oh no," she breathed, "is that—" "National news," Frank confirmed, looking out the window. "Looks like the story just went to another level." Maya felt a rush of anxiety. This was all happening too fast. She wasn't prepared for this kind of attention, for the expectations people now had of her. She was just a struggling diner owner who had offered a job to someone who needed it. "Frank, what do I do?" she whispered. "They think I'm some kind of saint. They think I'm running some big veteran initiative. I can't live up to this." Frank's weathered face softened with understanding. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture of a man who had faced far worse crises than this. "You have 2 choices," he said calmly. "You can tell them all the truth, that this has been blown out of proportion, that you were just being kind to one old vet, not starting a movement. Maya nodded slowly. Or, Frank continued, you can embrace it. Use this attention, this goodwill to actually do something bigger. Maybe this happened for a reason. I don't know anything about helping veterans on a large scale, Maya protested. Frank smiled slightly. You know how to help one. Sometimes that's enough to start. Maya looked out at the crowded diner, at the faces of people who had come because they believed in what she was supposedly doing. She thought about her father's words about the restaurant having heart. She thought about the crushing debts that had suddenly become manageable thanks to today's business. And she thought about Frank, how one small act of kindness had somehow snowballed into this moment. Ms. Chen, a young woman in a business suit, appeared in the kitchen doorway. I'm from Veterans Voice Foundation. Our director would like to speak with you about a potential partnership. He's very excited about what you're doing here. Maya took a deep breath and glanced at Frank, who gave her an encouraging nod. I'll be right out, she said, making her decision. The next few hours were a whirlwind of interviews, handshakes, and conversations that left Maya's head spinning. News crews set up equipment in the diner. A local politician arrived for a photo opportunity. The crowd outside continued to grow. By evening, Maya was physically and emotionally exhausted, yet strangely exhilarated. The story had taken on dimensions she could never have imagined, but something about it felt right. People wanted to believe in goodness, in simple acts of kindness making a difference. Who was she to deny them that? After closing, much later than usual, Maya sat with Frank at the counter, both too tired to speak for several minutes. You did well today, Frank finally said. Handled it like a pro. Maya laughed wearily. I have no idea what I'm doing, Frank. I told 3 different organizations that I'd meet with them next week about veteran outreach programs. I don't even know what that means. You'll figure it out, Frank said confidently. And you've got me to help. I know what vets need, what they're going through. Maya studied him, this man who had appeared in her life just 2 days ago and somehow catalyzed this extraordinary chain of events. Why didn't you tell me? She asked suddenly. Frank raised an eyebrow. Tell you what? About your medals, your service record. The reporter said you're one of the most decorated veterans in the state. Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. Doesn't matter. Medals don't keep you warm at night or put food on the table. It matters to people. It's why this story has resonated so much. No, Frank shook his head firmly. It's resonated because of you. Because people want to believe there are still good people in the world who do the right thing without expecting anything in return. Maya felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. I just did what anyone would do. But that's just it, Frank said quietly. Most people wouldn't. They'd walk right past an old homeless vet without a second glance. You didn't. They lapsed into silence again, the events of the day settling around them like dust after a storm. So what happens tomorrow? Maya finally asked. Frank smiled enigmatically. I think you're about to find out. What do you mean? Before Frank could answer, Maya's phone pinged with a notification, then another, and another. She pulled it out, eyes widening as she scrolled through the alerts. A national morning news show wanted to interview her live. The GoFundMe had surpassed $50,000. The governor had tweeted about her. Frank, she whispered, this is insane. Welcome to viral fame, he said with a slight smile. Better get some rest. Something tells me tomorrow's going to be even busier. That night, as Maya drove home, her mind raced with possibilities. The diner that had been on the brink of failure was suddenly the center of attention. The debts that had kept her awake at night might actually be resolvable. And more importantly, she might have the opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of people like Frank, forgotten heroes who deserved so much better. It was terrifying, it was overwhelming. It was the beginning of something she'd never imagined. The next morning, Maya arrived at the diner before dawn, hoping to get some preparations done before the inevitable crowd arrived. To her shock, the parking lot was already filling up. People stood in groups, some with lawn chairs, clearly prepared to wait hours for the diner to open. As she pulled up, camera flashes started popping. Someone shouted her name. A microphone appeared in front of her before she'd even stepped fully out of her car. "Ms. Chen, can you tell us about your plans to expand your veteran outreach program?" "Maya, over here. Is it true you're starting a foundation?" "Ms. Chen, how does it feel to be called America's Restaurant Angel?" Maya froze, momentarily overwhelmed by the barrage of questions and the sea of faces turned toward her. This was beyond anything she had anticipated. This wasn't just local news anymore. This was a full-blown media circus. She scanned the crowd desperately, looking for a familiar face, and finally spotted Frank making his way toward her, leaning heavily on his cane as he navigated between reporters and onlookers. Sirens wailed in the distance as Maya stood frozen in the doorway of her small diner. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot where hundreds of people now gathered, their faces turned toward her with an intensity that made her heart race. Camera flashes popped like lightning. News vans with satellite dishes lined the street. A police officer approached, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Chen, we need to establish a perimeter. The crowd is getting larger by the minute." Maya's hands trembled as she clutched the door frame for support. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. Just yesterday, her diner had been nearly empty, another quiet day of struggling to keep the lights on. And now this. All because of him. All because of what she'd done for the old man in the tattered military jacket who'd appeared during last night's storm. "Ma'am," the officer's voice pulled her back to the present. "Did you hear what I said? They're here for you, all of them." Maya nodded numbly, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto a familiar face, the weathered features of the veteran who had changed everything. He stood at the edge of the gathering, leaning on his cane, watching her with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten wars. When their gazes met, he offered a small, sad smile. Too late, Maya realized exactly what he had done, and why her life would never be the same again. Frank made his way through the throng, reporters parting reluctantly to let him pass. When he reached Maya, he leaned close to speak into her ear. "I tried to warn you," he said, his voice nearly lost in the commotion. "Word got out about the fundraiser. It's up to $120,000 now." $120,000, Maya felt her knees weaken. "Frank, that's—" "I know." His weathered hand found her elbow, steadying her. "Let's get inside. I'll help you handle this." Together they retreated into the diner, the police officer keeping the crowd at bay. Through the windows, Maya could see more police cars arriving, officers establishing barriers to control the growing mass of people. "What do they want from me?" Maya asked, collapsing into a chair. "I can't live up to this. I'm not who they think I am." Frank's expression was sympathetic but firm. "You're exactly who they think you are. Someone who saw a person in need and helped without hesitation. That's all. But they think I'm starting some kind of movement, some big veterans program. I don't know how to do that." "Maybe you don't have to, not alone anyway." Frank gestured toward the window where representatives from various veterans organizations held signs of support. "There are people out there who have been fighting for veterans' rights and support for years. They just needed a spotlight. You provided that." Maya's phone rang again. She glanced at the screen and groaned. "It's the Today Show, the actual Today Show. They want me on tomorrow morning." "So do it," Frank said simply. "Use the platform. Tell people what veterans really need. Make it about more than just you and me." Maya stared at him, a suspicion slowly forming. "Frank, did you know this would happen? When I offered you that job, did you have any idea?" The veteran met her gaze steadily. "No, not like this. but I knew you were special when you offered me shelter instead of just sending me back out into the cold. Most people wouldn't have done that." A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. The police officer was back, looking apologetic. "Ms. Chen, the mayor is here. He's asking to speak with you." Maya looked helplessly at Frank, who gave her an encouraging nod. "You can do this," he said. "Just be yourself. That's who they're all here for anyway." Taking a deep breath, Maya smoothed her apron and stood. Whatever was happening, whatever storm had been unleashed by her simple act of kindness, she would face it. Not because she was a hero or a saint, but because she'd been raised to believe that a restaurant wasn't just about food. It was about heart. As she moved toward the door, Frank watched her with quiet pride. Neither of them could have predicted this outcome when he'd stumbled into her diner 2 nights ago, seeking only a cup of coffee and a brief respite from the rain. The mayor was already speaking as Maya opened the door, his voice carrying over the clamor of the crowd. "A shining example of American values in action," he was saying into a cluster of microphones. "The kind of community spirit that makes our town great. Ah, here she is now. Maya Chen, everyone." Applause erupted as cameras swung toward her. The mayor, a man Maya had never personally met, embraced her as if they were old friends, positioning them both toward the cameras. "Ms. Chen," he said, beaming, "on behalf of our community, I want to thank you for what you're doing. Your initiative has put our town on the map and shown America what compassion looks like." Maya swallowed hard, acutely aware of Frank standing just behind her, of the hundreds of eyes watching, of the phones recording her every word. "Thank you, Mayor," she managed, her voice surprisingly steady. "But I need to clarify something. There is no initiative, no program, not yet anyway. I simply offered a job and housing to a veteran who deserved a chance. That's all." The mayor barely missed a beat. And that simple act of kindness has inspired thousands. Which is why I'm here to announce that the town council has unanimously approved a matching grant for whatever funds your GoFundMe raises, up to $200,000, to establish a permanent veterans assistance program based at your restaurant. More cheers erupted. Maya felt the ground shift beneath her feet. $200,000, a permanent program, based at her tiny diner. "Mayor," she began carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I run a restaurant. I don't know the first thing about establishing a veterans program." "That's where we come in," a new voice announced. A tall woman in military dress blues stepped forward from the crowd. "Colonel Rebecca Winters, retired," she introduced herself. "I represent the Veterans Coalition of America. We've been trying to establish a support center in this county for 3 years without success. What you've done has created an opening we never had before." The colonel handed Maya a business card. "We have the expertise, the volunteers, and the connections. What we've lacked is a physical location people actually want to visit and enough public support to secure funding." She gestured toward the diner. "You have both." Maya felt Frank's presence beside her, steady and reassuring. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "A partnership," Colonel Winters replied. "Your diner becomes a hub where veterans can get meals, find resources, connect with services. We provide the staff, the training, the administrative support. You provide the heart that made people care in the first place." It was surreal, standing there with cameras rolling, negotiating the future of her family's diner on national television. Yet Maya felt a strange clarity descending. This wasn't what she had planned. Nothing about the past 48 hours had been what she planned. But maybe, just maybe, it was what was meant to happen. "I'd need to maintain the regular restaurant business as well," she said slowly. "This was my father's legacy." Colonel Winters nodded. "Of course. The two missions can complement each other. We already have architects volunteering to design an expansion to the building. The publicity has brought contractors offering donated materials. And I want Frank involved every step of the way," Maya added firmly. None of this would be happening without him. Wouldn't have it any other way, the colonel agreed, extending a hand toward Frank, who shook it with evident respect for a fellow veteran. The mayor, clearly pleased with how things were developing in front of the cameras, clapped his hands. So we have an agreement in principle. Chen's Corner Cafe will become Chen's Corner Cafe and Veterans Center, the first of its kind in the state. As the crowd cheered again, Maya felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. In just 2 days, her life had completely transformed. The failing diner that had been a burden was suddenly the centerpiece of something meaningful, something that mattered. And it had all started with a cup of coffee and a decision to see the humanity in a stranger. I think this calls for a celebration, the mayor continued, ever aware of the optics. Ms. Chen, would you be willing to open your doors today for a special event? The town will cover all costs, of course. Maya glanced at Frank, who gave her a slight nod. We'd be honored, she said, but I have one condition. Name it, the mayor replied eagerly. Every veteran eats free, today and every day from now on at Chen's. The declaration brought the loudest cheer yet, and even Frank looked surprised by her boldness. But Maya knew it was right. Her father had always said that food was more than sustenance. It was dignity, community, care made tangible. If his restaurant was going to become something new, that principle would remain at its core. The next few hours passed in a blur as town officials, veterans groups, media, and curious citizens transformed the diner into an impromptu celebration. Maya cooked alongside volunteers who stepped up to help feed the massive crowd. Frank, despite his physical limitations, directed operations with the natural authority of a former sergeant, ensuring everything ran smoothly. By mid-afternoon, the event had taken on a festival atmosphere. A local band set up in the parking lot. Children ran between tables decorated with hastily acquired red, white, and blue bunting. Veterans of different eras, from World War II to Afghanistan, shared stories and found connections. During a rare quiet moment in the kitchen, Maya found herself alone with Frank for the first time in hours. Are you okay with all this? She asked him. It's happening so fast. Frank considered the question, his blue eyes thoughtful. I've learned that life rarely asks if you're ready before it changes. But yes, I think I am. What about you? This wasn't what you signed up for when you offered me that cup of coffee. Maya looked out through the service window at the crowded diner, at the laughter, the conversations, the sense of purpose that filled the space. No, she admitted, but maybe it's what this place was always meant to be. Frank nodded, understanding more than she said. Your father would be proud. This place has heart now more than ever. Before Maya could respond, Colonel Winters appeared in the kitchen doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here you both need to meet. She stepped aside to reveal a distinguished elderly man leaning on a walker, wearing a jacket covered with military medals that clinked softly as he moved. This is Congressman James Wilson, the colonel introduced him. He served in Vietnam with Frank and now sits on the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Frank's expression transformed instantly. Jimmy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jimmy Wilson. Hello, Sarge, the congressman replied, his own eyes glistening. Been a long time. Maya watched in amazement as the two men embraced awkwardly. Their age and physical limitations no barrier to the powerful emotion of their reunion. I thought you were dead, Frank admitted, pulling back to study his old comrade's face. After that last firefight. Nearly was, Wilson confirmed. Spent 8 months in a military hospital. By the time I got out, the unit had been disbanded, lost track of everyone. He shook his head regretfully. Then this morning I see your face on the national news. Couldn't believe it. Congressman Wilson flew in specifically to see you, Colonel Winters explained. When he learned what was happening here, he wanted to be involved personally. Wilson nodded. Frank saved my life in the jungle, carried me 2 miles with a bullet in his own leg, and now I find out he's been homeless." The congressman's voice hardened with controlled anger. "This is exactly why I've been fighting for better veteran services for decades." He turned to Maya, studying her with keen eyes. "What you've started here, young lady, it could be a model for communities across the country. A place where veterans aren't just receiving handouts but are part of a community where they have dignity and purpose." Maya felt the weight of his words, the responsibility they placed on her shoulders. "It's all happened so fast," she admitted. "I'm still trying to catch up." Wilson smiled understandingly. "The best movements often start that way, with one person doing the right thing without calculating the consequences. My staff is already drafting legislation to create a grant program for similar initiatives nationwide. With your permission, we'd like to call it the Chen Holloway Community Veterans Program." Maya blinked in surprise. "You want to name a national program after us?" "After what you represent," Wilson corrected gently. "The idea that everyday citizens and small businesses can be part of the solution if given the right support and framework." It was overwhelming. Maya looked to Frank, who seemed equally stunned by this latest development. "I think we need a moment to process all this," she said finally. Wilson nodded. "Of course, but I'd like to speak at today's event if you're comfortable with that. Let people know that what's happening here won't just be a fleeting feel-good story but the beginning of real, systemic change." After the congressman left them, Maya leaned against the counter, feeling suddenly exhausted. "Frank, this is bigger than us now, much bigger." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face contemplative. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said finally. "That cup of coffee, just a simple cup of coffee on a rainy night, and now all this." He gestured toward the packed dining room, the cameras, the important people who had descended on the small-town diner. "Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" he continued. "How many other cups of coffee could change lives if we just took the time to see each other, really see each other?" Maya understood exactly what he meant. In a world that moved too fast, that valued efficiency over connection, that walked past suffering because acknowledging it was inconvenient, a simple moment of genuine human recognition had somehow created ripples that were still expanding outward. "Do you think we can live up to all this?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "The expectations, the responsibility." Frank smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. "We don't have to do it all ourselves. Look out there." Maya followed his gaze to the dining room, where veterans were helping serve food. Community members were donating supplies, professionals were offering services. "That's the real miracle here," Frank said softly. "Not what you did for me, but how it reminded everyone else what they're capable of doing. You just lit the match, Maya. They're building the fire." The metaphor struck Maya as particularly apt. She thought of her father, who had built this place not just as a business but as a gathering spot, a place where people connected. He would have loved seeing it filled with purpose like this. "Then I guess we'd better get back out there," she said, straightening her apron. "We've got a fire to tend." The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Congressman Wilson's speech, broadcast live on several networks, transformed what had been a local human interest story into a national conversation about community-based solutions to veteran homelessness. Donations poured in through the GoFundMe, which had now surpassed $200,000 and triggered the town's matching grant. Architects huddled in a corner booth, sketching preliminary plans for expanding the diner to accommodate its new dual purpose. Veterans organizations distributed information about existing services and collected data on needs that weren't being met. Local businesses pledged ongoing support, everything from free haircuts to job interview coaching. Through it all, Maya moved through the crowd, serving food, listening to stories, connecting people who could help each other. It felt right in a way that simply running the diner never had. This was the heart her father had spoken of, not just feeding bodies but nourishing souls. As evening approached, the celebration showed no signs of winding down. Lights had been strung across the parking lot, creating a warm glow as darkness fell. A documentary crew had arrived and was conducting interviews with veterans about their experiences, both in service and after returning home. "You should get some rest," Frank told Maya, finding her in a quiet corner around 8 o'clock. "You've been going nonstop for 2 days." Maya shook her head. "I'm fine, there's still so much happening." "And it will all still be happening tomorrow," Frank countered. "And the day after that. This isn't a one-day event anymore, Maya. It's a marathon, not a sprint." He was right, of course. The exhaustion she'd been keeping at bay through sheer adrenaline was beginning to catch up with her. Her feet ached, her eyes burned, and her mind was struggling to process everything that had transpired. "What about you?" she asked. "You've been working just as hard." Frank smiled wryly. "I took a nap earlier. One advantage of being the old veteran, everyone's here to help. People insist I take breaks." Maya laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. When was the last time she had really laughed? Before her father's death, certainly. "Go home," Frank urged gently. "I'll keep an eye on things here with the colonel. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be another big day." "The Today Show," Maya remembered with a groan. "I forgot about that." "They're sending a car for you at 5 a.m., Frank confirmed. "All the more reason to get some rest." Maya hesitated, reluctant to leave yet knowing he was right. "You'll be okay here." Frank gestured toward his old friend, Congressman Wilson, who was deep in conversation with Colonel Winters and several other veterans. "I'm surrounded by the best support system I've had in years. I'll be fine." Finally convinced, Maya slipped away, avoiding the reporters who still lingered around the edges of the event. As she drove home in the darkness, her mind replayed snippets from the day. The mayor's announcement, Wilson's speech, the faces of veterans who had approached her with tears in their eyes to thank her for caring when so many others had turned away. It was all so surreal. 3 days ago, she had been on the verge of losing her father's restaurant, drowning in debt and doubt. Now she was at the center of a movement she'd never intended to start, with resources and support she could never have imagined. All because she'd seen the humanity in a homeless veteran asking for a cup of coffee. Maya slept deeply that night, her body and mind exhausted beyond dreams. The alarm jarred her awake at 4 a.m., a brutal reminder of the new reality she inhabited. She showered quickly, put on the outfit a network stylist had helped her select the day before, and was waiting when the black SUV pulled up at precisely 5 o'clock. The driver, a young woman with a clipboard and an earpiece, ushered Maya into the backseat with practiced efficiency. "We'll be at the remote studio in 20 minutes, she explained. "Hair and makeup will need about 45 minutes, and then you'll be live at 7:05 Eastern Time. The segment is scheduled for 8 minutes. Maya nodded, still half asleep and overwhelmed by the pace of events. "Will Frank be there?" she asked. "Frank Holloway, the veteran who—" "Mr. Holloway will be joining by separate feed from the diner," the driver explained. "The producers thought it would be good visually to see him in the actual location where everything started." It made sense from a television perspective, but Maya felt a pang of disappointment. She had come to rely on Frank's steady presence during the whirlwind of the past days. "The Colonel and Congressman Wilson will be with him," the driver added, seeming to sense Maya's concern. "Everything's being coordinated." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Maya was ushered through a side entrance of a local television affiliate that would serve as the remote location. Makeup artists and hair stylists transformed her from an exhausted diner owner into someone who looked like she belonged on national television. Producers briefed her on the questions she would likely be asked and coached her on keeping her answers concise and compelling. "Remember, this is morning television," a young producer advised. Keep it positive, inspirational. People are eating breakfast. They want to feel good about the world. Maya nodded, though inwardly she questioned whether sanitizing the harsh realities many veterans faced was really doing anyone a service. Frank wouldn't want his story reduced to a feel-good segment that let viewers feel good without confronting the systemic issues that had led to his homelessness. At exactly 7:05, Maya found herself seated before a camera, a voice in her earpiece counting down to live broadcast. 3, 2, 1, you're on. The studio monitors showed the main Today show set in New York, where two hosts introduced the segment with practiced enthusiasm. A small-town diner owner offers a homeless veteran a job and a place to stay, and unwittingly starts a movement that's sweeping the nation. One host began. Chen's Corner Cafe has become ground zero for a community-based approach to veteran support that's capturing attention from Capitol Hill to Hollywood, the other continued. Joining us now is Maya Chen, the restaurant owner whose simple act of kindness has sparked this extraordinary chain of events. The camera switched to Maya, who smiled nervously, acutely aware of the millions of people potentially watching. Maya, thanks for joining us this morning, the female host said warmly. Tell us how this all began. Taking a deep breath, Maya recounted the story, Frank coming in from the rain, their conversation, her offer of shelter and eventually employment. She tried to emphasize that there had been nothing extraordinary about her actions, that she had simply responded to another human being with compassion. And Frank is joining us now from the diner, the male host announced. Frank Holloway, good morning to you. The monitor split to show Frank seated at the counter of Chen's Corner Cafe, looking surprisingly comfortable before the cameras. The diner behind him was already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Morning, Frank responded with a nod. Frank, you're a decorated Vietnam veteran who fell on hard times, the host continued. How does it feel to suddenly be at the center of a national conversation about veteran support? Frank's weathered face turned thoughtful. It's not about me, he said firmly. Never was. It's about all the veterans out there who don't get noticed, don't get helped, the ones sleeping under bridges or in their cars, the ones whose PTSD or injuries make it impossible to hold regular jobs, the ones who served their country and then got forgotten. His directness seemed to momentarily take the hosts aback. This wasn't the light, inspirational tone they'd anticipated. And what Ms. Chen did, Frank continued, wasn't extraordinary because it was heroic. It was extraordinary because it should be ordinary. Because seeing each other's humanity, helping each other, that should be the baseline, not the exception. Maya felt a surge of gratitude for Frank's candor, for his refusal to let the story be simplified into a feel-good segment that missed the larger point. We understand Congressman James Wilson is there with you, the female host said, clearly trying to steer the segment back to safer territory. He's sponsoring legislation inspired by what's happening at Chen's Corner Cafe. The camera widened to include Wilson, who nodded gravely. The Chen Holloway Community Veterans Program would provide matching grants to small businesses nationwide that partner with local veterans organizations to create integrated support centers, Wilson explained. The model Maya and Frank have stumbled upon here, combining practical assistance with community integration and dignity-preserving employment, addresses many of the shortcomings of our current systems. For the remainder of the segment, Wilson outlined the legislation while Maya and Frank fielded questions about the plans for the diner. Maya emphasized that this wasn't about charity, but about community, about recognizing that veterans were valuable members of society who sometimes needed support to overcome obstacles not of their own making. One final question, the male host said as the segment neared its end. Maya, your life has changed dramatically in just a few days. Do you have any regrets about offering that first cup of coffee to Frank? Maya smiled, the answer coming easily. The only regret I have is that I didn't do it sooner, that any of us have to think twice about helping each other. My father always said a restaurant isn't just about food, it's about heart. I think that's true of communities too. We're rediscovering our heart. As the segment ended and the technicians began removing her microphone, Maya felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had just spoken to millions of people about values she deeply believed in. Whatever had brought her to this moment, luck, fate, social media algorithms, she was beginning to accept that perhaps she was exactly where she needed to be. The driver returned her to the diner, which was even busier than the day before. A line stretched around the block, with people waiting hours for a chance to be part of what was happening inside. Veterans organizations had set up information booths in the parking lot. Volunteers directed traffic and helped coordinate the crowds. As Maya made her way through the throng, people called out thanks and encouragement. Several pressed donations into her hands. Others shared stories of veterans in their own families who had struggled with the transition back to civilian life. Inside, the diner had been transformed. One section had been cleared to make space for meeting areas where veterans could connect with service providers. A bulletin board overflowed with job offerings from local businesses. Several laptops had been set up for resume writing and benefit applications. Maya found Frank at the counter, surrounded by fellow veterans who were sharing stories and laughter. He looked more alive than she had yet seen him, his blue eyes bright with purpose. "There she is," he said warmly as Maya approached, "America's favorite restaurateur." Maya rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help smiling. "Please don't. It's strange enough without the titles." "You did great on TV," Frank assured her. "Kept it real, made it about the cause, not just a heartwarming story." "I learned from the best," Maya replied, nodding toward him. "How are things here?" Frank gestured around the bustling diner. "Colonel Winters has been coordinating with various organizations. They've already helped 3 veterans apply for benefits they didn't know they were eligible for. 2 have housing interviews tomorrow. 1 has a job interview this afternoon." His voice grew quieter. "This is making a real difference, Maya. Real lives changing." Maya felt the weight of his words, the magnitude of what was happening and the responsibility it entailed. This wasn't a temporary feel-good story anymore. It was becoming an institution, a model, a movement. "The architects want to meet with us about the expansion plans," Frank continued. "And there's a lawyer here to help set up a proper nonprofit structure. The colonel thinks we need to formalize things quickly to handle all the donations properly." Maya nodded, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the logistics but determined to ensure everything was done right. "Let's meet with them now. The sooner we get organized, the more effectively we can help people." Over the next several hours, Maya and Frank sat in conferences with professionals who had volunteered their services: architects, lawyers, accountants, marketing experts. The vision for Chen's Corner Cafe and Veterans Center gradually took shape, an expanded facility with the original diner at its heart, surrounded by support services, meeting spaces, and eventually transitional housing in an adjacent property that a local developer had offered to donate. Throughout the discussions, Maya insisted on preserving the core mission, a place where veterans could find not just services but community, where they could be seen not as problems to be solved but as valuable citizens with unique skills and perspectives to contribute. "The food remains central," she explained to the architects. "Breaking bread together, serving others, that's how we maintain dignity and connection." By evening, preliminary plans had been drawn, legal frameworks established, and a timeline created for the transformation. What had begun as a spontaneous act of kindness was evolving into something structured and sustainable. As the last meeting concluded, Maya found herself alone with Frank in her father's old office, a small room off the kitchen that had been used primarily for storage until now. "It's really happening," she said quietly, looking at the plans spread across the desk. All of this from one cup of coffee. Frank nodded, his expression contemplative. One cup of coffee and the courage to see me as a person, not a problem. He paused, studying her. You know, I've been thinking about something all day. What's that? Why me? Why did this happen with me and not one of the dozens of other homeless vets in this area? What made that night different? Maya considered the question. I don't know. Maybe we were both just in the right place at the right time. Frank shook his head slightly. I don't think it was that random. I think it was because you were at a breaking point with the diner. Because you understood what it meant to struggle, to feel like you were failing despite your best efforts. His insight startled Maya. It was true. The night Frank had appeared, she had been questioning everything, wondering if she should just sell the diner and admit defeat. Empathy comes easiest when we recognize our own struggles in someone else's, Frank continued. You saw me that night, really saw me, because you knew what it felt like to need a break, a chance. Maya felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the truth in his words. And now we get to create that chance for others. Frank nodded, his weathered face softening. That's how healing works, for individuals, for communities, for a country. We help each other through the broken places. As they sat together in the small office, surrounded by plans for a future neither of them could have imagined days earlier, Maya felt a profound sense of rightness. The diner that had been her burden was becoming her purpose. The financial struggles that had seemed insurmountable were giving way to abundance, and the lonely responsibility she had carried since her father's death was now a shared mission with an expanding community of support. Outside, the sun was setting over the crowded parking lot where people continued to gather, veterans finding resources, volunteers offering services, community members bringing donations, media documenting it all. Maya could hear the murmur of conversations, occasional laughter, the clinking of dishes from the diner where meals were still being served despite the late hour. We should get back out there, she said finally. People will be wondering where we are. Frank nodded, rising stiffly from his chair. The work never really ends, does it? No, Maya agreed, gathering the architectural plans. But it feels different when it has purpose. As they moved toward the door, Frank paused, his hand on the knob. You know, when I came in that night, I was just looking for a warm place to sit for a while, a cup of coffee. I never expected, he gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had transpired. Neither did I, Maya admitted. But maybe that's how the best things happen, not from grand plans or strategies, but from simple human connection. Frank smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. Your father was right about the heart, Maya. It changes everything. Together, they stepped back into the bustling diner, back into the movement they had accidentally created, the community they were intentionally building, and the future they would shape together, one cup of coffee at a time. Through the windows, Maya could see more people arriving, more lives about to intersect with theirs. The sight no longer filled her with anxiety but with a quiet determination. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, and there would be many, she would face them with the knowledge that she wasn't alone. That was the true miracle of what had happened here. Not the viral fame or the donations or the political attention, but the web of connection that had formed when one person had chosen to see another's humanity and respond with compassion. As Maya moved through her transformed diner, greeting veterans and volunteers, answering questions and solving problems, she felt her father's presence more strongly than she had since his death. He would have loved this, the bustle, the purpose, the heart evident in every interaction. She caught Frank's eye across the room, where he sat with a group of younger veterans, listening intently to their stories. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. One cup of coffee, one moment of connection, and nothing would ever be the same again. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this.